Hi, friends. Welcome to my perfectly imperfect ICD-10 book tabbing tutorial. All right, so you're going to see that my book is already tabbed. Where is the excitement in watching me peel stickers, right? So what I decided to do to make this a little bit faster is just to tab my book, show you the resources that I used to tab it, and then kind of just give you a quick run through. Tabbing your ICD-10 book, even though tabs are not included with the manual, you can purchase the tabs off of Amazon. Now, quick tip, when you go on Amazon to search for ICD-10 tabs, you will not find tabs specifically for the Bucks edition, okay? But what you will find is tabs referenced for the AMA ICD-10 code book. That purchase or that code or tabs is perfectly acceptable. You're going to end up with some extra remaining tabs, and that's totally fine. The tabs that are included will be sufficient for your Bucks workbook, or excuse me, your Bucks ICD-10 manual, okay? So save yourself the trouble of trying to search for a Bucks ICD-10 tabbing set, just use the ones from AMA. Alrighty, so the cool thing about tabbing your ICD-10 manual is that it gives you an opportunity to also explore each section, okay? So when I opened up my tab pack, now obviously these are blank now, right? But they had color-coded tabs on them, and I'll walk you through. And it also came with this little handy tabber, right? To keep everything in line. So on the flip side of that tabber, it gives us some instructions for placing book tabs. It says place the tab positioning guide over the books page that you're going to install the tab on. Step 2, the tabs are printed in order, so make sure you select the appropriate tab, gently peel it off from the backing paper. Step 3 is aligning the tab with the rounded angle on the alignment guide. Press the tab into place and what is that? And lit the page. I'm pretty sure that's supposed to be lift the page. Okay. And be sure you lift just a single page. Yes, that is an important tip because I have tabbed more than one page together before. And then, yeah, sometimes you tear your pages. All right. And then step 4 is going to be fold the tab in half and press onto the back side of the page. In the case that you need to remove and reapply, yes, I've had to do that. Don't press too hard at first. Yeah, because you can readjust these tabs, which I had to do in a couple sections in my book this year. By the way, guys, whether you're watching this video in 2025 or 2026, until there's a new chapter that's included inside of this manual, this tutorial will be sufficient for any version or year of your coding manuals. Okie dokie. So what I did, one of the first tab, or actually let me mention this, when you look at the tabs that you purchase, they're going to have page numbers. Don't follow the page numbers because they don't coincide with the Bucks book, okay? So the first tab that you'll want to identify is the tab that says official guidelines, and it says TOC/section 1. TOC means table of contents, all right? So your first page will be section 1, and this is the table of contents. So the table and contents for the official guidelines for reporting include section 1, conventions, general coding guidelines, and chapter specific guidelines. So this first page is your table of contents. So section 1A covers conventions related to ICD-10. Section 1B covers general coding guidelines. Section 1C covers chapter specific guidelines, okay? So again, that would cover your table of contents, which is on this very first page, and then section 1, which covers conventions, general coding guidelines, and chapter specific guidelines. Okay. The next, and so first, let me show you how I did this. The next thing I did was flip it over. Okay. And then I lined up the numbers with the edge of the page and go about halfway in on that red line. If you mark it out to here, your tabs will be too close in and they won't stick out for you to see what's written on them. Okay, so come in about halfway on that red line, and then you'll want to put your placement tab. Okay, and so you can see how this is lined up perfectly imperfect, right, with number 1. And then when I get to my official guidelines sections 2 through 4, okay, and I'll walk you through that so you can kind of identify where that's at in your book. Section 2 will say this is what you're looking for. Section 2, selection of principal diagnosis. So section 2, and I'm just going to flip here. Section 3 is your reporting of additional diagnosis, and then there's your section 4, diagnostic coding and reporting guidelines for outpatient services. So that is specific to this tab right here, official guidelines, sections 2, 3, and 4. And because we put section 1 on tab 1, right, the next thing you would do is you would line up your page, and then you would apply tab 2, okay? And that's what keeps it looking good and in order there. And mine were a little bit, this first one was just in a little bit too much, but we get the drift. All right. Now, the next section after your guidelines is going to be anatomy illustrations. There are some tabs for anatomy illustrations. I didn't tab mine, but feel free to go through and review the anatomy or the body system, and then you can connect it to the specific chapter, right? And you could always tab it. I chose to skip it. All right, so moving on to the index. So notice that I've tabbed up for my index, okay? Now, long ways or vertical. Okay, vertical, you can fit 7 tabs. Horizontally, you can only fit 5. Okay, so the next group of tabs that will be included is going to be index tabs. So the first index is index to diseases and injuries, and it's all alphabetic. So what I did, starting with index A, I lined it up, put my first tab. And then I went through and I found where my index, where the B's start in my index. And then I lined it up and put my B on line number 2. And then I did the same thing for C and then D. And then, where's my E? Oh, looks like I hopped back over and started E over here. Okay, perfectly imperfect. All right, so again, that's how you do it. And then once you get to 5, you have to start back over again, and then you start tabbing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, right? And that put me at I, and then I would start over again, J, K, L, M, N, O. Yep, O was 5, all right? And then you would do the same thing. So flip through each section, find where those letters, the beginning of those letters reside, right? And that's where you want to put that first tab at. All right, so moving on from the index section, let's get over to the next index, but we call this a table. This is the table of neoplasms. So find the tab that says neoplasm table, okay? Neoplasm table, and then you'll just tab it there and do the same thing. All right, so your table of neoplasms, just a quick descriptor here. Neoplasms are for your malignant in situ, and benign tumors, lesions, and then where they are at anatomically is all listed alphabetically, okay? So color-coded tabs are color-coded sections depending on the color, depending on the type of lesion, depends on the category that you would refer to. So if you had a malignant primary lesion of the abdomen, right, you would then find yourself at abdomen. If it was in the cavity of the abdomen, you'll be at C76.2. Keep in mind, by the way, that your table of neoplasms works just like an index. You don't code directly from this table. You would then defer to the chapter where those codes reside, and we'll get to that chapter. All right, up next, you're going to find your table of drugs and chemicals, and then the tab will say table of drugs and chemistry, okay? And then under table of drugs and chemicals, this would be all the external causes. So for example, if a patient was to have some type of an adverse effect from example, let's say, where's like acetaminophen at? Something easy here. Oh, here's a good one. Actually, not a good one, but a great example. How about a substance? How about antifreeze, right? So here we go. A poisoning assault on with antifreeze has a special code, right? So everything's listed alphabetically as far as the substance, and then how that substance was encountered, whether it's an adverse effect, right, like a reaction, even a patient not taking enough of a medication, right, that would be considered underdosing. And then you also have accidental poisoning, so maybe they thought it was Gatorade, right? All right, so depending on the reason, determines what the code that you will apply. And again, this table, look at it like an index. This is just a starting point. Then you still have to take that code that you find and then go to the specific chapter where that code resides to get the complete code. All right. All right. The next tab that you're going to look for is your external cause tab, external causes. All right. So if an injury, right? So if an injury occurred at, let's say, a skate park, right? So a person was skating and they ran into a car, right? So that would explain, and let's say they fractured their collarbone, right? So now we have a reason for a fractured collarbone. Uh, Skateboard accident, collision with vehicle, right? So you would find the codes that describe how that cause of injury occurred. So if it isn't a pathological reason, okay, then there's got to be some type of external cause reason. And that's where these codes come into play. You'll use these a lot with like workers' comp. If you bill for workers' comp, injured workers, right? There's always going to be a reason, an external cause for the injury. All right. Up next, we're going to get into our actual chapters. Okay. So the first, and we don't really look up codes by chapters, even though they are divided into chapters. Our codes we're always looking at codes by the letter. Okay. So A and B, these are your infectious disease codes. I always think amoebas and bacteria. That's how I like to just pair it up. So chapter 1 covers certain infectious and parasitic diseases. The code range goes from A00 to B99. And then you will find the accompanying tab, right? So A00 through B99. And at this point, right past my external causes, that put me at tab 5. So tab 6 for me is going to be my A codes, my A through B codes, all right? And then my next section is going to be my neoplasms, chapter 2. So these codes go from C00 to D49, all right? If you see a code that starts with the letter C, that means that it is malignant, okay? Cancer. If your code starts with a D, then that means it is benign. Okay, so benign D codes, and then you've got your malignant codes that start with C's, okay? All right, and then the next section is going to be the continuation of the D codes. This would be chapter 3, diseases of the blood and blood-forming organs. All right, and now you can see I'm back at number 1. The next chapter is chapter 4. This is your endocrine, nutritional, metabolic diseases. So think diabetes, okay? Diabetes, thyroid conditions, glandular conditions. All right, moving on. Chapter 5. Chapter 5 is your what I refer to as F codes. These are your mental health and neurodevelopmental disorder codes, F01 through F99. Also keep in mind that the 3 characters are just the categories and will need additional characters to fully expand to describe your patient's condition. All right. All right, moving on. Now we're into chapter 6. I call this the G codes. The G codes is diseases of the nervous system. Okay. So it could be your central nervous system, nerve roots, anything. Meningitis is a great example. Even a headache would be coded under the G code nervous system. All right, moving on to our H codes. The first group of H codes is for diseases of the eye and adnexa. So the sclera, cornea, glaucoma is also coded in this section as well. All right. Next up is the last grouping of H codes. So we were in the eyes and now we're in the ears, ear and mastoid processes. All right, moving on. Now we're going to jump to our eye codes. This is chapter 9. Eye codes cover circulatory system. So anytime that you see a code that starts with an I, you've got to think your veins, your arteries, your arterioles, your capillaries, your heart conditions, hypertension, myocardial infarctions, etc. All right. HIJ, here I am. Chapter 10 is your J codes. J codes cover your respiratory system. So bronchitis, pneumonia, pharyngitis, sinusitis, all of those codes. So if it starts with a J, know that we're dealing with your lungs, your bronchioles, your nasal passage, your sinus, nasal passages, larynx, trachea, etc. Okay? All right. Moving on to K codes. This is chapter 11. K codes cover diseases of the digestive system. Fun fact, these codes also cover diseases of the oral cavity. Yes. So if you work for a dentist, okay, you will code for those cavities, for that gingivitis through chapter 11. Up next is L codes. This is chapter 12. This is going to be the integumentary system, okay? So L00 through L99. So your L codes are going to cover your rashes, your skin conditions, eczema, psoriasis, tinea pedis, sunburns, alopecia, vitiligo, etc. All right. Next, you're going to find chapter 13. We call this the M codes. This is your musculoskeletal section. It's going to cover osteoporosis, arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, juvenile arthritis, and anything in between. And again, this musculoskeletal section, this is going to be any fractures that are coded here are going to be pathological fractures. Okay. All right. Next up is chapter 14. This is your N codes. Okay, so that's N00 through N99. This is the diseases of the genitourinary system. So your kidneys, your ureters, male genital organs, diseases of the breast, female organs, genitourinary. Okay. Moving on. Element O. O is chapter 15, and this covers pregnancy, childbirth, and puerperium. Rules for O codes. O codes trump all other codes. So what does that mean? That means, let me read you a sequencing priority rule. Obstetric cases require codes from chapter 15, codes in the range of O00 through O9A. Chapter 15 codes have sequencing priority over codes from other chapters. Additional codes from other chapters can be used, but the primary code will come from your O codes. And then another thing to point out is all of this that you see shaded in green at the beginning of every chapter is your chapter specific guidelines. Some chapters have a lot, some have none, and they're reserved for future expansion. Guidelines are everything, okay? As billers, we've got to know coding guidelines because codes is what drives the revenue. And we need to know what sequencing orders, if there's any specific carrier rules, modifier rules, etc. Your carrier rules will come from your insurance companies, but those baseline guidelines for how to apply and sequence the codes, when it's appropriate to use two codes or you need an additional code, whatever that looks like, those will be laid out for you in each specific chapter. All right, so moving on to our P codes. So our P codes is perinatal period. So perinatal is defined as before birth through the 28th day following birth. So obviously these are for the newborn record, okay? All right, or birth through 28 days. All right, so now LMNOPQ. Q codes. Now we're in chapter 17. And look, I'm back at number 1 again. All right. So I've got all the way down to my perinatal period, tab 7. And now I'm back up at tab 1. Congenital codes, Q codes, that's the best way to look at it. Anytime you see a code that starts with a Q, know that is a congenital condition. That means that the person must have been born with it in order to apply a code from this code category. All right, moving on from our Q codes, our congenital conditions. And this also covers chromosomal abnormalities as well. Okay. All right, moving on. R codes, chapter 18. This is going to be your signs and symptoms. Also, abnormal clinical and laboratory findings not elsewhere classified. So I'm going to go over a quick little rule about assigning signs and symptom codes. So I'm going to read you chapter specific guideline B. Use of a symptom code with a definitive diagnosis code. Okay. So it says codes for signs and symptoms may be reported in addition to a related definitive diagnosis when the sign or symptom is not routinely associated with that diagnosis. Okay. So it says such as various signs and symptoms associated with complex syndromes. It says the definitive diagnosis should be sequenced before the symptom code. And it says signs and symptoms that are associated routinely with the disease process should not be assigned as additional codes unless otherwise instructed. So let me give you a really simple example of this. If I have a runny nose, I have a headache, I've got watery eyes. Okay, so those are all signs and symptoms. And then the doctor says, oh, you have seasonal allergies. Well, I no longer am going to code for the signs and symptoms because those are common to seasonal allergy sufferers, right? So then the definitive diagnosis would be the seasonal allergies, and we would not include the headache, runny nose, watery eye symptoms and signs. All right. So that's chapter 18. Now let's move on to chapter 19. These are called the S codes. Actually, it's S through T. Now, special rule to know about codes that start with an S or a T. Every single one of the codes from this chapter will require a seventh character. Okay, so pay attention to that. Seventh characters are actually discussed in the very first guideline. Guideline A, application of seventh characters to chapter 19. I'm not going to read all this right now because this is a book tabbing video, but please take the time to get familiar with each chapter. You don't have to memorize the codes, but it's important to know the guidelines that apply to those codes, okay? All right, let's move on. Oh, I guess I should tell you that the title of chapter 19 is injury, poisoning, and certain other consequences of external causes, right? So we're going to, anything from open wounds, lacerations, fractures to the orbits, the mandibles, contusions, um, dislocations, all of these types of injuries, external cause injuries would be coded here. And another point to make is that a lot of these codes would include an external cause code to also explain how the injury occurred, right? So let's say that, that I had I was driving like a forklift, right? I'm in construction, and there was something that occurred. I fell off the forklift. Well, there's going to be a fracture, and then there's going to be a code from an external cause section to describe, operating heavy equipment, whatever it was. This is really helpful putting this all together, especially for insurance companies, because they need to know whether or not that they are the responsible payers. So, or who is the responsible party to cover the medical expenses. So I was talking about like workers' comp earlier, right? So those little details helps them determine who is the appropriate payer. It also goes into corrosions, burns, let's see, poisoning by adverse effects. So again, this goes right back over to wanting to also include the reason, right? Was it accidental, assault, adverse, etc.? All right. Moving on to chapter 20. This is the external causes of morbidity. So remember how we were talking about the external cause section at the beginning of your manual, right? You have to think about this like an index. The chapter that's associated to this index is chapter 20, okay? So whatever code you find here, you're still going to want to follow it up and confirm it and see if there's any specific instructions, and they will be found in chapter 20, okay? All right, almost to the end, my friends. Chapter 21, and where am I at with my tabbing again? All right, now I'm moved down to tab 5. This is going to cover what we call Z codes. So factors influencing health status and contact with health services. So every time that a patient goes to see and have an encounter with a physician, it may not be because they're sick, right? They could be having an encounter with a physician for birth control, right? So I'm fine. I'm not unwell, but I need this prescription, and so I need to have an encounter with a physician. That would be coded with a Z code. Another great example of this is when you go to the doctors for your annual checkup, right? There's nothing wrong with you, but the doctor still has to apply a reason for that encounter. Okay. And your Z code section, chapter 21, has a lot of guidelines. So make sure you take a little peek at these, right? So you can just get a better idea. And then the categories for your Z codes, there's person encountering health services for examination. For example, your well code would be Z00.00, encounter for adult medical exam without abnormal findings, adult checkup not otherwise specified. I think that's good. For you. Okay. All right. What else do we have? Hormone sensitivity status, do not resuscitate status. You could go in for blood typing. Again, nothing wrong with you, just gonna have your blood type. There's also status codes like body mass index. Those would be additional codes that you would include. For example, if you knew if a patient had morbidity or obesity, and there was a specific BMI, you could also include that. So Z68. Let's just take a quick peek at that really quick. There's also a status code, for example, if a patient is on long-term on dialysis, there's also like a status code for that as well. There's also status codes for socioeconomic statuses, right? For unhoused, maybe domestic violence, group home. So there's also personal history, abuse, childhood, adult, etc. There's all different types of other conditions or encounters, right? So threat of job loss, sexual harassment, military deployment, occupational exposures as well, encounters. So exposures, orthopedic aftercare. So it's kind of a mixed bag. So it says Z codes represent reasons for encounters. A corresponding procedure code must accompany a Z code if a procedure is performed. These codes are provided for occasions when circumstances other than a disease, injury, or external cause classifiable to categories A through Y89 are recorded as diagnosis of problems. This can arise in two main ways. A, when a person who may or may not be sick encounters the health services for some specific purpose, as to receive limited care or service for a current condition, donate an organ or tissue, receive a prophylactic vaccine or an immunization, or to discuss a problem which in itself is not a disease or injury, such as we were talking about those socioeconomic codes, ICD-10 codes. It also says B, here's another main way, when some circumstance or problem is present which influences the patient's health status but is not in itself a current illness or injury, like exposure to dust, right? A problem may influence a person's health status but is not a current illness or injury itself. Okay. All right. So those are our Z codes. And then lastly, this new chapter, well, not new. This came about what came about as a need after COVID-19 and those vaping related disorders that popped up around that same time, if you guys remember. I think they were calling it like popcorn lung. Anyways, this chapter, kind of new, maybe a couple years old. Codes for special purposes, U codes. Codes from this chapter are never on maternal records. Okay. And there's just a couple codes here. Emergency use, vaping related disorders, and then there's your COVID-19. And then, of course, there's some specific instructional notes that you'll want to defer to anytime that you have a diagnosis of COVID-19. And then you also have a code for post-COVID-19 conditions. So not much expansion so far. It started out with just these two codes. This is new. I think this came about in maybe 2022. All right, so just 3 codes here, and that's the end of the book. You made it to the end. All right, congratulations. You will have some extra bonus little tabs too. So if you do make a mistake, no worries, right? Just take a small Sharpie, right? And then you can just tab over your erroneous tab. I'd say it's better not to peel tabs off if you see them start to tear. Just write on a new tab and cover up the old one. All right, friends. I hope this was helpful. Again, I've also heard from other students in the past that you can buy these off of Etsy as well. I got mine again off of Amazon. Let's see if I can share my screen here really quick with you guys just to show you. $10, not bad, right? Make sure you get the year for whatever you're currently seeing this video in, okay? But again, until there's a new chapter, everything else is laid out the same. All right, friends, I hope this was helpful. I will see you in the next episode.